Hey guys, if you just want to stand up and join us in worship. People come together, strangers, neighbors, our blood is one. Children of generations, of every nation, of kingdom come. So don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Oh, whoa, oh, oh, Jesus, our redemption, our salvation is in his blood. Jesus, light of heaven, friend forever, his kingdom come. So don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Oh, whoa, oh, oh, swing wide, all you heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. All the children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Swing wide, all you heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. All the children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Jesus, our redemption, our salvation is in his blood. Jesus, light of heaven, friend forever, his kingdom come. Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God, yeah. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. As we go into the bridge, I just really want you to think about how powerful these lines are and just how much God loves us, and just really tune into what he's saying to you. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Yeah. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, you're coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
Dear God, I pray for Noah and the video he's about to show us, God, and I pray that we get something out of tonight. I pray that for all the people that came here, that you use them, and that whatever they gain from tonight, they can go out and they can use. I pray that we got something out of today, and that we apply it to our lives. Amen.
The fourth question we need to ask for the evidence for Christianity is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Think about that question. Did Jesus rise from the dead? That's a historical question, which means we'll have to do a historical investigation. So how do we do history? Well, to establish historical truths, historians have developed 4 criteria to determine what has happened in the past. Let me go over this 4 criteria. The first one, it needs to be recorded in an early source. That just simply means it's recorded close to the event and not far away from the event. If I was in a classroom and I had 2 students, one taking notes as the class was going on, and another 5 years after the class, he decided to take notes, whose notes would you prefer? Obviously, you would prefer the student who was taking notes as the class was going on, not the one who took notes 5 years later. The second criteria to establishing historical truths, it needs to be recorded in multiple sources, independent of one another. It's like if I had a student who was absent from class and he came to class the next day, he could ask one student to borrow their notes, but if they made a mistake, there's no way they would know. But they could ask another student and have another set of notes to compare to get an accurate set of information about the class. So you want an early source and you want multiple sources. The third condition is you want it to lack legendary embellishment, or you don't want it to sound made up or contrived. This is just the attitude of, it sounds convincing. The fourth condition that you want to establish historical truth is you don't want the narrative to have a competing story, because if you have 2 different stories, then you don't know what actually happened. So you want 4 criteria to establish historical truths: early sources, multiple sources, lacks embellishment, and there's no competing story against it. One way to solidify the idea of establishing historical truths through these criteria is through examples. A great example I like to use is George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. You know the story you learned when you were a kid in elementary school? Well, let's look at this narrative through the 4 conditions and criteria that we just went through. What is the earliest source of information we have of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree? Well, it's a book called On the Life of George Washington by Parson Mason Weems. What's interesting is that book was written in the 1820s. Now, that's not an early source of information of the life of George Washington, who died in 1799, especially on the childhood of George Washington. If you wanted an early source of information, you'd go to his diaries, his letters, congressional records, presidential decrees is what you would look at for early sources of information on the life of George Washington. The second criteria is multiple sources. Is there any other sources of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree? The simple answer is no. The Parson Mason Weems narrative is the only one that we have. And then the third condition is the kicker, the lacking legendary embellishment. Sometimes I call it the ring of truth condition. Now think about it. When George Washington chopped down his cherry tree, his dad came home, he was upset, and what did George do? He told the truth. He said, "I cannot tell a lie, it was I." Now, one of the things we know about children is when they're about to get in trouble, they tend to lie. But George Washington told the truth. But then he told the truth by rhyming his confession. Who rhymes their confession? I cannot tell a lie, it was I. So we don't even have to look at the fourth condition, so we don't know if this story is historical. That's how we look at historical truths through these 4 conditions. And given those 4 conditions, there are 4 things about the fate of Jesus that we can establish as historical truth. In fact, if you can remember the word beat, you'll remember these 4 facts. The first letter, B in beat, is for the burial of Christ. The E is for the empty tomb. The A is for the appearances of Christ, and the T is for the transformation of the disciples. Let's take a look at the first fact, the burial of Jesus. The burial fact states that after Jesus died, he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And there are 6 reasons why we know this is true. The first one is, we know Jesus died. In 1986, there was a professional journal called the Journal of the American Medical Association who wrote an article titled On the Physical Death of Jesus, in which 2 historians and a doctor examine the physiological process of what happens to the body through crucifixion. You can look this article up online and look at what happens to the process of crucifixion from a medical perspective. The article, in short, declares that Jesus died before he was removed from the cross. So we have a medical journal declaring that Jesus was crucified and died through that process. The second reason we know that Jesus died and was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea is it's recorded in early source information. As you recall, the New Testament is made up of 27 different books and a dozen or so authors. And in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about the death and burial of Jesus. And verses 3 to 5 dates within 5 years of the life of Jesus, a very early source indeed. Another source of information about the burial of Jesus is the book of Mark, the earliest gospel written, where it says Jesus died and then he was buried. So the first fact is very early and has multiple sources attesting to its historicity. Another reason we know the burial story is factual is Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. As you recall, Joseph of Arimathea was declared to be on the high priest or Sanhedrin of the Jewish council. If there was no Joseph of Arimathea, they would know it, and they would say there is no Joseph of Arimathea on the high council. And if they didn't put Jesus in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and there really was a Joseph of Arimathea, then he would declare that Jesus wasn't buried there. Two more reasons why we know the burial story is true. It lacks signs of legendary embellishment. After Jesus died, what did they do with him? They buried him, just like we do today. That doesn't sound embellished or made up, does it? And there's no other competing burial story against the burial narratives that we have in the Gospels. So we know that Jesus died and was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. The second fact that we know about the fate of Jesus is E in beat, the empty tomb. Now, what do I mean by this? Simply, the tomb was found empty. Now, I'm not stating why it was found empty. I'm just stating it was found empty. There's multiple reasons it could be empty. Maybe they stole the body. Maybe they went to the wrong tomb. Maybe Jesus rose from the dead. But remember, we've got to get our facts laid out first before we explain how the facts came about. So we know the tomb was found empty for the following reasons. The empty tomb narrative is recorded in early source information in Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, which again dates within 5 years of the life of Jesus and implies the empty tomb. Also, the book of Mark talks about the tomb being found empty, which is the earliest source of information in the Gospels that we have about the life of Jesus as well. So we have early and multiple sources for the empty tomb. In fact, the earliest opponents of the Christian movement admitted the tomb was empty by stating that the disciples stole the body. Now, if the disciples did steal the body, guess what that implies? The tomb was empty, and that's the fact that we're exploring. Also, the tomb was discovered by women, and given the status of women in the earliest first century Jewish world, if they were lying about this, they would not have women discover it, they would have men discover it because of the status that women had in that early first century world. The third historical fact that we're going to examine in beat is A, the appearances of Christ. This fact states that individuals and groups of people experienced Jesus alive from the dead. Now, this fact might actually seem to beg the question that Jesus really did rise from the dead, but the operative word here is the word experienced. They experienced something which they interpreted as Jesus alive from the dead. It could be that they hallucinated, received visions, or saw Jesus alive from the dead. But the fact of the matter is, they did have some type of an experience of Jesus alive from the dead. The appearance narratives are multiple and varied. In fact, it's the most attested fact that we're examining in this series about the fate of Jesus. The appearances to the 12 disciples is recorded in Luke and Paul and John's writings. The appearances to the women are recorded in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John. And the appearances in Galilee are recorded in Matthew, Mark, and John. In fact, Gerd Ludemann, who is a skeptic of the resurrection and an expert on the life of Jesus at the University of Göttingen in Germany, states the following: the appearance narratives are historically certain. Now, of course, he doesn't believe the resurrection, but he does believe these narratives took place and are accurate. He calls them visions or hallucinations. The fourth historical truth that we're going to examine is T, the transformation of the disciples. The disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe Jesus rose from the dead, that they were willing to die for that belief. Now, just because they're willing to die for the belief doesn't make it true. And that's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is they truly believed it because they were willing to die for it. And that's good evidence that they really did believe it. They might be wrong. They might be believing in a lie as the truth, but they did sincerely believe it. In fact, they had every predisposition not to believe in the resurrection. The Jewish belief of the afterlife did not include any resurrection of the dead prior to the end of the world. So they weren't expecting anyone to rise from the dead prior to the end of the world. Also, the man that they were following for 3 years of their life was crucified as a criminal. So they're politically defeated in this instance as well. And then third, they're religiously defeated, because in the Old Testament, it says, "He who hangs on a tree is cursed by God." And Jesus is hanging on the tree in crucifixion. And so as they look upon Jesus and as they're hiding, they're religiously and politically defeated. As historians do their practice, they have to come to the part of their work where they have to provide the best explanation. So you have the facts, clues, if you will, and now you have to solve the case or provide the best explanation. Now, there's two conditions for providing the best explanation: explanatory scope and explanatory power. Explanatory scope is an explanation that explains all the facts, not some, not most, but all of them. And explanatory power explains each fact adequately in a non-contrived fashion. So there's a series of options to explain these four facts, but the best one will explain all of them and each of them satisfactorily. One possible explanation that's been given is conspiracy, that the disciples either lied or stole the body. It's one of the earliest explanations about the fate of Jesus. Now, what does that explain? If the disciples stole the body, it does explain the empty tomb. But remember, we have to explain all the facts, not some. If they lied and stole the body, then they know the resurrection is a lie. And why would they die for it? Obviously, people might die for a lie thinking it's true, but no one dies for a lie knowing it's a lie. So it doesn't explain all the facts. Another possible explanation explaining the fate of Jesus is the apparent death, sometimes called the swoon theory. This is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He passed out, was buried in the tomb, and revived, and actually got out somehow, appeared to the disciples, and they mistakenly believed he rose from the dead. Now think about this. The first fact states that Jesus died and was buried. Explanations should explain facts, not explain them away. So this doesn't explain the first fact at all. Think about what Jesus has to do to get out of the tomb. With nail-pierced hands and feet, he's got to push a rock out of the way. Maybe he's a Hulk Jesus, and let's say he gets out of the tomb. But what's on the other side of the tomb? Guards are guarding the tomb. Well, maybe he's Super Ninja Jesus, and he sneaks past them. Then he has to appear to the disciples in his beaten, emaciated, bloodied state, stating that he defeated death. I dare say that wouldn't compel the disciples to fall on their face and worship him as God. They'd probably look at him and say, "Defeat death, Jesus? That's a little bit of an overclaim. Maybe barely escape is a better way to put it, because you're in dire need of medical attention." Another possible explanation of these four facts is the disciples and the women went to the wrong tomb. Now, if they went to a tomb that was empty, it does explain an empty tomb. But I doubt that would explain a transformation. If I went to an empty tomb, my first expression would not be, "Oh, they must be alive from the dead." I would probably be asking, who moved the body? But also remember, the first fact states we know where Jesus was buried, in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. If they went to the wrong tomb, the opponents of Christianity could go to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea and expose the body of Jesus, marching it and parading it down the streets of Jerusalem, defeating the Christian movement. But it doesn't actually explain all the facts. Another possible explanation is hallucination. And this is the most popular way to explain these facts, that the disciples hallucinated Jesus alive from the dead. And there are cases of bereavement experiences where people hallucinate their loved ones still alive. But does hallucination explain all the facts? Well, it looks like it might explain the appearances. And even if it did, it wouldn't explain the empty tomb. If Jesus was still dead and they're hallucinating, and then the opponents again would only have to expose their belief by going to the occupied tomb. But the fact is, the tomb was empty, and the hallucinations don't explain it. Also, hallucinations are highly individualistic, like dreams. It'd be like me waking up in the morning, turning over and saying to my wife, "Hey, I had this really cool dream. Did you enjoy it?" Of course, she would look at me like I was crazy. Hallucinations are like that as well. And remember, the appearances occurred to groups of people, not just individuals. Hallucinations occur to individuals, not to groups. So hallucinations is a very poor explanation of these four facts. The last explanation, one you're probably familiar with, is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, before we accept it, let's see if it explains all four facts. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then that admits that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And if God raised Jesus from the dead, that explains why the tomb was found empty. And if God raised Jesus from the dead, it explains why Jesus is appearing alive from the dead. And last, if God raised Jesus from the dead, it explains why the disciples were willing to die for the belief that God really did rise Jesus from the dead. So the best explanation that explains all four facts is God raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus is alive.